Hello there and welcome to this, the 221st edition, not including specials, of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. And man, there's a lot of bad news to talk about this week. Joining me first of all, John Linneman.
Oh man, you're right. That's a shame because I like episode 221. I feel like that's a fun number. So,
is it your lucky number?
No, but it's a good number.
Seemingly not.
So welcome everyone to episode 221 of DF Direct Weekly.
And of course, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich. Interesting show this week. Xbox oriented, but for probably not very good reasons. And actually, I don't think there's any Switch 2 on the docket, which has to be a first in at least 3 or 4 months.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Support a question about it, though, so it's not a completely Switch 2 free zone. Anyway, let's crack on with our first news topic of the week. So, first news topic, man, how do you deal with this one? Basically, untold misery inflicted on hundreds, possibly thousands of people within the Xbox division, laid off in the wake of cuts and a reorganization. Many games that have been failed, cancelled. I just can't really get my head around the scale of this. I always say this, but it's really difficult to comment about this sort of thing when there are so many lives basically disrupted or even ruined by this sort of stuff. John, I'm going to go to you first on this one. I mean, let's talk about the headlines here. A lot of games have been cancelled. A lot of studios have experienced cuts. Studios that some might consider kind of untouchable have been very indecently touched by all of this. It's shocking stuff. I don't really know where to begin. What do you want to talk about?
Yikes, that is difficult. I mean, obviously the most impacted aspect of this, the most disappointing side, is that a lot of people lost their jobs. And tech layoffs continue. That's pretty bad stuff. That's continued to happen. And it does seem to be this combination of the post-pandemic age, after that sort of hiring spree we saw, plus the changes to, as I've learned this week, looking more into it, changes to Section 174 of the U.S. tax code, which essentially changes the way that R&D is like taxed. Instead of it's spread out over years rather than simply deducting it immediately. So it's sort of like changed the way that companies view this stuff. And it feels like the most easy way to reduce spending and keep the money high is a headcount cut. But what's really disappointing about the Xbox layoff in particular is that Xbox was profitable, right? This is not a business that was failing. It makes perfect sense for a large company to cut off the businesses that have struggled for years and are not making any money, but Xbox was making money. So this really feels to me like this continued obsession with driving AI development. Microsoft is all about Copilot. It's all about investing as many billions as they can into it. There's even these tone deaf posts from people there basically saying oh yeah, you can, those that lost your jobs, you can use Copilot to help you, to feel better and figure out where to go next with your career. And we're looking to up our game devs with, by leveraging Copilot to make them more efficient.
Is this really happening?
Yes.
That's astonishingly tone deaf.
Absolutely. There was a LinkedIn post this morning. Let me actually find it. Yeah, this just blew my mind. Where executive producer at Xbox Game Studios, Matt Turnbull, suggested, Brandon Sheffield actually found this. He suggested on LinkedIn that people who have been let go should turn to AI for help. And he posted this long spiel about how you can use large language model AI tools such as Copilot to help reduce the emotional and cognitive load that comes with job loss. This is honestly just astoundingly tone deaf. And you also see it in, I have to say, Phil's message as well, who, in that message to employees, he had to take the time to address shareholders by saying yeah, we have our strongest, our best lineup in Xbox history. We're making all this money, but we got to let you go. It's kind of the message you get. So all of this just feels like this these orders coming from on high, from top Microsoft, that all seems to center around the investment in things like AI, which is where they're like super focused right now. Now, that's not to say that Microsoft hasn't had its issues. The Xbox brand has struggled a lot since Xbox One. Actually, since the later Xbox 360. I mean, the damage that Don Matrick did is legendary, completely shifting the momentum of the brand and reducing things in a way that, like, just never worked out. And then they've never been able to find their way back, I would feel. And even with all these studio acquisitions, Xbox has continued to struggle to get really key titles out the door, both in a timely fashion and at the quality fans demand. I mean, I think the Halo Infinite situation is legendary at this point. They dropped the ball big time. You know, I would say Turn 10 dropped the ball with rebooting Forza Motorsport last year. You know, games like Starfield are good, but it didn't hit the way that I think they would have wanted. And it just felt like Microsoft was unable to catch a break and just get these titles at the door that resonate with people in the way that the biggest games from Sony and Nintendo do, right? But they were still making money, and like Game Pass was still making money. So like, to me, it just feels like all of this ties into Microsoft just shifting where their business is going, and they don't view Xbox, they don't view games the way that perhaps people like us want. Right. And it does. And because of all the job loss associated with it, and it's not just Xbox people that lost their jobs, by the way, they did a lot of head cutting again. I think the total Microsoft cuts this year is over 15,000 people, which is pretty insane.
Right.
So the whole situation is just dark and upsetting. And it's something that we're really seeing in the West, and something, especially in the West. But, you know, something that really hit home this morning when discussing this with some friends was like, somebody noted that, like, you know, you look at somebody like Andrew Wilson, Bobby Kotick, when he was still at Activision, you know, they're making 30 million, 150 million a year as the CEOs. They're even taking pay increases. They're making so much. You look at Nintendo, and the CEO is making like 1.8 million. Miyamoto is making like 1.4 million. I mean, this is consistent with other Japanese companies, and they're not going through this same sort of like extreme layoff stuff either. It just feels like the world of capitalism has become even worse than ever, and like this like short-sightedness and focus on AI is really a big symptom of it. It's very frustrating to watch.
There was a report from Windows Central saying that Microsoft's overall aim to build up $80 billion worth of AI server infrastructure may have had something to do with this reorganization. No idea if that's true or not. And here's the thing, the amount of visibility you have on the decision-making behind all of this stuff, you're only seeing the end result of it. You don't really know how all of these decisions came to pass. But you're right, John. There has been some issue in terms of delivery of a consistent delivery across the years of quality games, and we kind of thought we'd crossed that bridge, right? Because you know the last 6 months, 9 months from Xbox has been nothing short of exemplary.
I think, though, Rich, the problem there, more than anything, is one. I think it. So. They had the lineup in the last 6 months that they needed to have like 3 years ago, right?
Right.
And it's too late. The genie's out of the bottle. They'd already shifted to this multi-platform strategy. The energy around Xbox is like out. It's gone. By and large, it's just become a publishing arm at this point. And that passion, I mean, for better or for worse, you know, every console has very passionate fans, and it feels like the Xbox brand essentially like just did away with all that, kicked the fans to the side, and so there's not that much to be passionate about anymore. You know, individual games, yes, but the brand as a whole, not so much. And that's too late. But then, of course, obviously, the other big part here is that they canceled a lot of big games, right?
Yeah, let's go through that because there's a lot to get through, isn't there?
Yes.
Should we talk about Perfect Dark first? Because there's been quite a lot of discussion about that, and also I think some misinformation that's got out there. But Yeah, take it away on that one.
Yeah, so Perfect Dark, it's no secret this has been in development for a long time. I think it was clearly a very difficult project. But as far as, just based on chats around, the impression I get is that it was actually getting back on track. And we don't know for sure, but the word is that, they were making good progress. It was primarily Crystal Dynamics working alongside Sumo Digital, with the initiative sprinkled in there as well. I would say the initiative concept didn't really work out as a small creative house. Lots of clashing personalities, perhaps. Things not necessarily going as you would want there. But Crystal Dynamics, Sumo, they're very experienced developers. And there was this discussion around the demo shown where it's oh, this is all fake. This is just a pre-rendered thing, or just a totally faked demo. It's not really playable. They were nowhere near that. And I don't think that's the case. I think what they presented was a traditional vertical slice. And what people on the development team have even very specifically said, it was a fully playable piece. Yes, it played best if you followed the exact, intended sort of progression through the demo, but it didn't mean you were locked into that either. The systems were there, they were functional. It wasn't just pure smoke and mirrors, but there was some smoke and mirrors. And unfortunately, that's just the reality of doing any of these pre-release demos, right? And you got to do it carefully in order to sort of make sure that what you're showing is actually representative of what you're going to be able to achieve. This is something that we've seen Sony got pretty good with this after a while, after massively failing with their CG trailer-a-thon that was the PS Triple reveal. But then you look at later stuff, especially the Naughty Dog demos, the Resistance demos, stuff on the PS3, and then going forward from there, you look at the reveal of Killzone Shadowfall and all that, they were delivering demos that were technically those vertical slices, but they delivered what the game received. Microsoft's no stranger to this either. They did it with Halo 2, of course. Bungie did back in the day. Which we know, that was also a narrow vertical slice. It didn't really ship in the game, but it was representative and playable. And I think that was the case here. So I think, and I'm sad that they were not able to continue this. Obviously, we're not privy to any of the financial details here. And from a business perspective, I can see there's frustration with how much time and money have likely been sunk into the project. And it also brings up the sunk cost fallacy, when you think about continuing this. But still, they needed something like this, I feel. They needed games like this in their portfolio. And to just kill it like this after it seemed like it was getting back on track, I don't know, man. I'm not happy about it.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that was effectively cancelled. There's Everwild. That's no longer happening. So that raises questions about the future of one of the industry's most,
and
long.
Greg Mayall's left as well, who's been there.
Yep.
He was there for 35 years. I mean, he was basically the guy that made Banjo, among many other things.
Yeah. There's also talk that Romero Games' new shooting game was cancelled by Xbox. Avalanche's Contraband trailer disappears, speculation mounting. Turn 10, there's reports there that 50%, I mean, this is kind of like what I'm talking about sort of untouchable developers getting huge cuts. I mean, Turn 10 apparently losing 50% of their staff.
It's nuts.
Shocking. I mean, absolutely shocking. Oliver, where do you want to start on this? This is horrible.
To add to your list, there was also an MMO at ZeniMax called Blackbird. It was apparently Blackbird was the code name, and it was being developed with, I think, about 300 employees. That was completely shuttered. That's a project that apparently was in the works since 2018. Apparently, Phil Spencer was so impressed that he had to have a controller pulled away from him in a demo, at least according to some lore that's been spread around about this title. So that's another big one. Obviously, big MMOs are games we do not see that often, but when they hit big, obviously. And apparently, they lost faith in the project. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think this sucks. Especially Perfect Dark is such a weird game to kind of cancel because they showed it off. It was such a big title for them at that point. I know that John was very excited for that game. I know they had a lot of interesting talent behind it. I know they had a really interesting vision for it. They obviously showed off a vertical slice, but it was kind of like in-engine stuff. And as you said, that's like pretty representative for a lot of games in that stage of development. So it's not unusual. Apparently the Seattle Times reported this is intended to free up AI resources, and obviously Microsoft is very interested in pursuing that with an $80 billion, I think, capital expense in this year alone, like you mentioned, Rich, which is obviously a huge thing. But yeah, I mean, there are a couple notes here. I mean, I think that there's definitely an argument that Microsoft isn't staffed up, is staffed up to a level that probably is not sustainable in the same way that other companies are staffed up. Because like when you look at Nintendo, a lot of people have been making a lot of hay about this, but they are an industry-leading company in this space, obviously. They have a very successful console, certainly by a large margin, much more successful in at least the console space than Microsoft has been. And they have a total headcount of 8,000 employees total, whereas Microsoft is sitting at something like 20,000, 22,000, something in that range,
but
with Sony sitting somewhere in the middle of that range.
And I know people don't like when you butt into a conversation, but Oliver, Microsoft had record profits. They're making so much money, so many billions of revenue coming in. This is not a case of like, oh, they can't survive. This is just like more shareholder placating and like this investment crap that they're so focused. And I'm not a business. It's obvious I'm not a business guy here, but like when you just look at that, it just feels like at what point do these companies just like cut enough people where nobody can freaking buy anything from anybody and the whole economy just collapses?
And I think it is a failure of management ultimately to have studios that are as talented as Crystal Dynamics working on upcoming games, that are as talented as the developers at Rare or ZeniMax Studios, ZeniMax Online, working on games for years and years, in some cases 8 years, 10 years, to have those games canceled or in some cases released without necessarily the requisite quality like we saw with Forza Motorsport in 2023. I think that's very unfortunate. And like you said, with Phil Spencer, obviously people have very complicated feelings about that particular matter at the moment, but when he's like issuing the statement that's like, I recognize these changes come at a time when we have more players than ever, all this stuff, that is really just a statement that's intended to placate the only people who matter, which are shareholders, right? He's not really talking to the affected employees insofar, he's talking to them insofar as he's doing all of the kind of window dressing you need to do in this kind of circumstance, but really it's a message to shareholders saying, we have a powerful platform, we have a slate of games, we are headed to the future with, a bold idea here, and we're going to actually have a successful go of things in the future, even if we're downsizing at the moment. And if anything, I'm sure shareholders, at least they seem to like this news, they reacted positively, at least in terms of the share price. That certainly does leave a bad taste in the mouth, but it is kind of the business, but at the same time, I think it reflects a management that maybe is not working as effectively as it does at some other, platform holders who are doing a better job with their established studios.
There are questions about accountability, obviously, which never really get addressed in the PR surrounding this. It's, if a game like Perfect Dark's been in development since 2018 and all we've got is a vertical slice, the question is, why, how, who is accountable? And then secondly, when it comes to, here's the other thing, of course, is that Xbox is a division within Microsoft. And, to what extent are staff like Phil Spencer and Sarah Bond actually fully in control of their budgets?
Well, not as much these days.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's just so much. Obviously, from an outsider perspective looking in, it's definitely an awful thing to see. The actual mechanisms behind why this happened is completely opaque. We don't really know. It just is extremely unfortunate, and the human cost in this is astonishing, to the point where you look at these statements from Phil Spencer and Matt Booty, and it doesn't really encompass the scale, the ramifications of what it is they've actually done.
Agreed.
And to what extent those projects that are affected, to what extent they actually had to go. We just don't really know. Is it a purely finance-led decision? Is it just, a decision from on high that has to be enforced by Xbox executives? But clearly, I think there's a perception problem here, a perception of what Xbox is and what the brand is at this point, because every time there is some sort of positive announcement, it's followed up by something unspeakably bad and evil looking.
Yeah,
that's the bottom line. I mean, it's only like a couple of weeks ago that we were talking about this new next generation direction, the partnership with AMD, which looks really, really exciting. Then out of the blue, it's like, okay, well, despite the fact we're making all of this money, and despite the fact we've got so much to be looking forward to, we're going to be making all of these cuts and inflicting misery on people.
I love that according to Jason Schreier's report, one source, he says, was told last year by Matt Booty in a meeting that closures of Arcane Austin, Tango Gameworks, Alpha Dot, etc. were done for the purpose of justifying increased headcount for other game studios that needed it, such as ZeniMax Online Studios working on Blackbird.
Right.
So it's just more of this stuff where it all feels like sacrifice to the AI blood god at this point. And, man, for this whole topic, I am definitely upset because I do know people affected by this. And when you see what it's doing to people, it really hurts. And it's just those tone deaf replies from execs that's just shockingly, it's painful to read it. So, and then there's just, beyond that, there's the human cost. There's the, just what it means for the console industry, what it means for Xbox. I think at this point, no company should ever allow themselves to be acquired by Microsoft. If you're a gaming company, don't do it. Stay out of it. It's a bad deal. People were saying this during the Activision stuff. Everyone that supported that was wrong completely. If we supported it, we were wrong. This was a big mistake. All of this stuff.
You can apply that to any kind of corporate acquisition, I think.
Not necessarily, but like,
well, look at what happened at Bungie, for example.
It's more the scale, right? Bungie is a single entity, and I think it's pretty clear that Bungie itself was moving in this direction anyways, right? I'm not sure Bungie's fate would have been different had they not been acquired, is what I'm saying. And some of these companies, the business reality is some of them without acquisition could not have made it. Furthermore, not every game project succeeds, right? It's very difficult to ship anything these days, as we know. And some of these just have to be put out to pasture after a certain point. It seems like the failure with Microsoft is that they allow these projects to go on far too long before stepping in. And then when they do step in, it feels like one of the first reactions is, well, just cut it. So like, it doesn't seem like they're getting the kind of support that you might get from other companies, right? Third-party companies working with Nintendo on Nintendo-developed games, for instance, have a very, very, very different track record. Nintendo really seems to support them and help them get stuff made. I mean, you look at what happened with like something like Metroid Dread. Like the track record of Mercury Steam wasn't actually very good before that, right? And then they helped them basically, essentially create like incredibly well-made games, and that changes the fate of the studio, I would say. Microsoft's not able to support these companies.
It's also really not helpful that most of these layoffs are occurring within the U.S. context, because in some other places, maybe you say, you lose your job, you have welfare to fall back on, you have your health care, but in the U.S., it's a different situation, right? So with so many things really tied to employment in the United States, you end up with these really like nasty situations where cutting someone off from employment just conditions a ton of other failure points in their life, right? So it's really challenging to deal with, and I completely understand and sympathize with people who are in this position, because it's a really terrible position to be in, right?
Let's deal with some supporter questions. Kevin Booth says, "Hi DF crew, exclamation point. Given the troubling situation continuing to develop within Microsoft and the Xbox team specifically, does this represent an Icarus moment for the Xbox brand? The topic of Microsoft's mega acquisitions of ABK and ZeniMax has been discussed ad nauseum as the Eye of Sauron, Satya, is hovering intently over Xbox to recoup the investment. While Game Pass offers great value to gamers, I can't help but wonder if Xbox leadership has crossed the event horizon on this strategy. Is selling full-price software on competing platforms enough to sustain the existing business model, or does this demand drastic and potentially very unpopular changes to Game Pass? Thanks and keep up the great work! Exclamation point. The funny thing is, of course, that Microsoft is bringing in record revenue, seemingly. And Game Pass seems to be working. As to whether it's the best possible solution for, the publication and distribution of games, I think that's still up for debate. I'm not quite sure whether this is actually an Xbox problem rather than a Microsoft problem that Xbox is a big part of. Any thoughts on that, Oliver?
I would hope that it's enough to sustain the existing business model. Like you said, Microsoft Gaming is a profitable enterprise, and even though they obviously absorbed another very profitable company recently, which perhaps explains some of that profit there. I would hope their core franchises are popular enough and make enough money. I think we might be at an inflection point with some AAA where maybe the business case for certain titles is not really making sense, but I wouldn't be able to comment. Like, obviously there are some titles like Avowed, like Indiana Jones, certain games that didn't hit super big on Steam, but you have to think with the Game Pass model, they might be doing really well on Game Pass. Microsoft, I'm sure, has their own metrics in terms of evaluating the relative success of different titles in the platform. But I could see, like, I think the merit in this question is I can totally see Microsoft moving away from certain styles of games, certain expenses in terms of their game allocation for any given year. But I don't think that Microsoft is in a particularly dire state. Like, they are profitable. They clearly have the revenues to sustain these projects. They just decided that for whatever reason, these projects, these studios were, first in the chopping block in order to potentially fund other ambitions in AI or other areas of the business, right? And that's ultimately not a very nice decision. But there are realities that face this business, but I don't think these are necessarily realities that are shaping this decision too much.
Right. We also have this question from Todd Weitzel. Is the Microsoft acquisition of ABK going to end up as catastrophic as letting Embracer get as large as it did? I don't know what you think about that, John, but I think the difference is that Embracer definitely looked completely unsustainable based on the kind of complete buying spree that they were going on, whereas the financials from Microsoft kind of suggested something different.
Yeah, big time. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the Embracer model couldn't be sustained, especially when they were so reliant on a deal that didn't go through with the Saudis. I mean, you can see that moment when Lars found out about that during an investor conference or some sort of talk, and they simply didn't have the money. Microsoft, right, of course, they do. They're making that money. But man, it's their this is difficult because obviously it seems to me that the leadership at Microsoft these days doesn't really have any interest or respect for games. Like, that's not where they're at. And whatever, that's not what Microsoft is as a company. They are primarily like a services company, and even more so than ever, it's Satya and them are obsessed with AI. And I think to them, they're just constantly looking for more capital and investment money they can throw at their AI project. And if they have no interest in the games market, it's very easy for them to just like slice and dice, right? Like, to them, it's just like, well, we can just use these resources to do the thing that I care about, which is AI.
Right.
So I think they could support Xbox. They could support these projects. They have the money. Xbox was not necessarily losing money. They were in the black. Like, I feel like if they had really wanted to do it, they probably could have. And I'm sure the Xbox leadership would love to have been able to continue. Now, I do think some of the projects that were canceled probably make sense. Something like Everwild, for instance, that went on way, way, way too long. It was clearly just not going to get done. They really needed to consider putting Rare on other projects, smaller projects. But that just ties into the overall Microsoft mismanagement of studios, where it feels like they give them too much freedom up into the point where they really need help, and then it's just kind of like, well, that's it,
I think there's an especial level of disappointment here because ultimately Microsoft are Microsoft, one of the biggest companies in the world. Huge amount of resources available. Also a platform holder, and with that comes a certain degree of responsibility. And also, of course, they become the focus, however weird it is, for, kind of almost fan worship for that particular brand. And it is the same, I guess, for Sony as well, for some reason, which I've never quite fathomed. So, obviously you're looking to them for leadership and you're not really seeing it here. And what you are seeing is profound disappointment and profound disappointment after profound disappointment, because a lot of this has echoes of the whole Hi-Fi Rush Tango Gameworks situation, where a game is lauded for being successful, and then suddenly it's, you know, the studio is closed or being sold off. There's always been a historical issue with messaging from Microsoft. Similarly, there's another case with this one where Everwild from Rare has been cancelled, and we've got comments from Phil Spencer saying, "Hey, it's coming along really great. The developers need time. We're going to give them time." Well, guess what? They haven't had time. It just really it comes across so badly, but it keeps on happening. I don't really want to talk about this much more. It's completely depressing.
I hate this topic.
Shall we move on?
Let's move on.
Okay, well, we're not going to move on that far for our second news topic, because this week, and indeed last week, there's been a huge amount of controversy about the concept of whether the Xbox hardware, as in a console, is actually going to happen or not. Is Xbox hardware dead or not? This actually comes from comments from Laura Fryer, who actually worked at the original Xbox launch, and she believes that the brand identity is basically gone. And a lot of the brand value that she added personally, she feels it's been squandered. I think the conversation has been slightly odd in the face of the fact that Microsoft has basically committed to a next generation Xbox. The question is, of course, what form that Xbox will take. I think we're going to expect to see something quite different from a prior console launch. Oliver, I'm curious about your comments on this one, because, yeah, I think the reason we're having this discussion is, again, due to poor communications from Microsoft. There's always kind of like a sort of level of interpretation that can be given to these comments. They should be a lot more crystal clear. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft loves to talk with their future plans and kind of like very vague, undefined terms here. I think it's quite clear that Microsoft is continuing to ship hardware, but a lot of the hardware they have in the future comes from probably third-party OEMs. Obviously, with the next generation Xbox project, that is very much a project that continues to exist, but like it doesn't really look much like Xbox hardware has up until this point. Basically, it looks like Windows machines with different levels of accommodation towards features like backwards compatibility, not consoles, or at least not traditional consoles, right? So I guess the question is, like, you know, they continue to exist in the hardware space, but is that a really strong hardware vision? Like Laura Fryer is kind of laying out here, was the vision behind the original Xbox was part of the Xbox 360, which she was around for? Or is that more of like a typical kind of Windows-ish morass of a bunch of undifferentiated hardware, some OEM-led, some Microsoft-led, with varying degrees of support and stability, right? We see this in the Windows space with Surface devices, where Microsoft participates in the Windows ecosystem, but they aren't necessarily the only ones in that ecosystem. They are one of many players in the ecosystem. Whereas I think with like the Xbox, traditionally, with the last 4 generations of Xbox hardware, it's been a pretty strong vision. You know, here is an Xbox Series X. We're going to support it for a generation. It has a console OS. It has exclusive games, right? Not anymore, but it did at the time when they were pitching it. It will go toe-to-toe with PlayStation with competitive pricing. This isn't that, or at least to some degree, it's not that. In significant ways, it's not that vision. But I think that is a meaningful shift away from what Xbox hardware has meant in the past. They will obviously ship something. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I would be very, very surprised if they did choose to cancel kind of the main thrust of this project, even if they are canceling projects like, or at least putting on hold, projects like the first-party Xbox handheld. But over the medium to long term, I think that is probably really diminishing what it means to ship Xbox hardware. And I think it is kind of a maybe even a slow exit from the hardware business, if not just a diminishment of their role within the hardware business for consoles and gaming boxes in general.
Yeah. John, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like this new model shifting towards more of a Windows-centric device is the only way forward at this point. Like, why would you release a closed, subsidized style console at this point as an Xbox, given everything that they've done in the last year? It makes zero sense. And frankly, I think to gain the most support, it would behoove them to have Xbox versions essentially be adjacent to PC versions in terms of development resources, because they've already made it clear that there's nothing. Xbox is just, well, it's everything apparently, but also like having a dedicated box that runs a different OS like the current Xbox does, that just adds more work for developers, and there's not really any reason for consumers to embrace that at this point. If they're not doing anything unique or special about it, it just becomes it's convenient to have a dedicated box on the TV that runs Game Pass, but a PC can do that too. So it does feel like this customized Windows-based experience is probably the way forward for them. And that, the traditional Xbox model, I would imagine it's probably not going to come back. And if it did, that would be a gigantic mistake, I think, right now. Like, there's just, the market's not there for it anymore. They squandered that. And it's been tough. And it's such a shame, though, when you look at the Xbox Series X is such a good machine, right? And it just feels like it never really got to take off, so to speak. It's a beautifully designed piece of hardware. It's the hardware inside is excellent. It's a unique form, but there's a lot going on that makes it an awesome traditional console. And it's just like, it hasn't really worked out. So it would be a mistake to do it again.
I think going forward, this is probably the only real viable path that makes sense for Microsoft to continue in the kind of console or console-like, whatever you want to call it, hardware business. But I do think like there are some really key questions about what Xbox is supposed to represent. Like on the so-called console side, it sounds to me a lot like the final form of this thing is just a PC with hardware back compat and an interface that is going to be common across many different kinds of PC devices. So what is the distinction behind those devices? Exactly how is Microsoft going to distinguish an Xbox PC or a PC that can run Xbox versus an Xbox device versus all these other devices they're branding as Xboxes? By the way, at a time when there is no Xbox interface on PC, there is nothing that remotely works like an Xbox on PC at the moment. There is nothing like that outside of maybe Steam, the Steam Big Picture mode, which is obviously not an Xbox. So I don't know exactly what Microsoft is doing with all this branding that suggests they're getting an Xbox category of device here. And I think that's what Laura Fryer is saying as well. You know, the Xbox is historically meant a console experience, at least, you know, at a stretch, a console-like experience. Microsoft is only delivering one of those at the moment, and it's called an Xbox Series X and S, right? It's not the PC.
But I think that's exactly the challenge here, is they need to figure out how to make that work. They haven't built the interface yet, or at least, you know, we haven't really seen it beyond what's been shown in that ROG Ally X. But that's where the challenge is, right? How do you make Windows 11 or Windows into something that feels still like a proper like game device that you'd use in your living room? Valve kind of figured it out, wouldn't you say? Like SteamOS is like this perfect little middle ground where it feels comfortably like, you know, like a gaming system, but it's still an OS underneath. You can still access extra features. And I think Microsoft Xbox games will be designed for whatever interface they come up with. And games that are designed for Xbox certified devices could just say target that spec, right? Like make like a set of specs that sort of fit that Xbox I guess branding. And if you meet this, then you can run games at this level kind of thing. And then if they open it up to stuff like Steam, it's more just like a free for all in the same way, I guess the Steam Deck is in a way. We're just like, well, you have the freedom to do whatever you want. We just can't promise it'll work. Only stuff that's like certified Xbox would work or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think SteamOS is definitely the model for this kind of thing, but I'd also think that SteamOS is a great experience. I'm not contesting that. I think Steam Deck is a terrific device. I think the new SteamOS devices are really interesting. I love Bazzite, obviously, which is a, you know, very similar conceptually to SteamOS. But to me, SteamOS, it's still on the Windows side of things. It's still on the PC side of things. It's not the same as a console in my view. So if Microsoft wants to get up to the level of SteamOS, where SteamOS is now, I mean, you know, go for it. If they can accomplish that, I think that'll be a great accomplishment. Maybe they'll move some Xbox so-called consoles, Xbox PCs. But in terms of equaling that Xbox experience, I think they are going to let some people down with that.
Now, what if they can get backwards compatibility going on Windows? That would be interesting as well. Integrate that into the Xbox UI that's part of Windows, but it just runs all your library. Going back to your original Xbox.
That's what they promised, have they not?
Right. Like that's what they've promised in the past, right? And delivering that would essentially mean they're bringing all this emulation stuff to the PC, which would be awesome.
It'd be cool at least if it was like 360,
at least,
you know, OG Xbox, some of these consoles that are a little bit further back in time where maybe the hardware grunt to run them on a generic PC box is mostly there, right?
That's right.
I think we've come a long way since the business update, where Phil Spencer sat down and told us that four games were going to be coming to PlayStation, and I just quickly looked that up. That was February last year.
Wow.
And here we are in July in the next year, and suddenly, obviously the four games thing was. I don't know whether you can say it was disingenuous, but we knew for a fact there were a lot of games being developed for PlayStation at that time. That's the reason why all of those rumors kicked off that caused the four games business update podcast to happen at all. And now we've kind of reached the point where Xbox hardware is going to be a thing, but it's going to be a very different thing to what we've traditionally expected. There will be backwards compatibility. Microsoft has confirmed that. There will be a next generation console, which, and again, we've got to hold them to this. The biggest technological leap ever in a console generation, I think, is what was suggested there. Mm-hmm. And I think they will do that. And I think they will do that by having, rather than having a traditional console in the console sense, it will be a kind of hybrid device that sits in the PC market as well. The chipset will work in, as a PC. It will be challenging the PC pre-built market, where the costs there are kind of eye-watering compared to console. So it will have terrific performance. It will be cheaper than PC pre-builds, but it will probably be a lot more expensive than you'd expect from a traditional console. That's my thought on it. Mm-hmm. And then you've got this AMD hookup, which basically ensures backwards compatibility on other AMD devices going forward on the PC space. So if that console is too expensive for you, then, if you've got some sort of AMD PC, it will probably be fine to run your backwards compatible library on that as well. I think there'll be a very different sense of what an Xbox piece of hardware actually is. And you're kind of seeing it with the ROG Xbox Ally X, where it is a bit, I think Laura Fryer addressed this, it's a bit of an odd proposition, isn't it? We're being told it's an Xbox, but if you were offered, John, the choice between a ROG Ally X that's called an Xbox and an actual first-party handheld made by Xbox hardware team, which one would you have?
the Xbox hardware team.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm thinking like I would have preferred to see them extend what they're doing with Surface to Xbox. You know what I mean? Because those devices are beautifully made, and they do have a feeling. Like, I feel like pursuing more like the Apple style in terms of the hardware stuff would have been more interesting.
Well, they might well be doing,
and maybe they are doing that. But yeah, you're right. Like when it's like, well, yeah, that's exactly right. Like the ROG Ally X does not feel like an Xbox, despite what the slogan might say.
I mean, maybe they'll just call the Surface Xbox and call it a day. But I think with the ROG Ally, I think with the Xbox Ally, ROG Xbox Ally X, if I'm getting that moniker right, I think I'm actually quite interested in that device. I would be very interested in having that device, at least if they do iron out some of the front end issues. I think it could be a really cool PC handheld. But again, is that an Xbox? People getting into this terminology, I certainly would really like a first party Xbox handheld. I don't think that's ever really going to happen here. But I think in terms of the Xbox Ally, like in terms of what they're doing, I think it will probably be a success, at least in the physical form factor front. I think that Asus does a really terrific job with their hardware designs, obviously coming from like a regular, non-Xbox Ally, an older Xbox, non-Xbox Ally. I think they do a really terrific job there. And I think if Microsoft does a good job with the front end, that'll be a good experience. But it's not a platform. It can't play older Xbox games, at least not at the moment, right? We'll have to see hopefully some improvement on that front before you can even really kind of put it in that same conversation, I feel like, as what people think of as an Xbox.
There are certain aspects to the strategy that I actually find quite exciting. For example, I suspect that this next generation console will be expensive, but it will be incredibly powerful, and it will be cheaper than an equivalent PC pre-built by quite some margin, simply by virtue of the fact that it's going to be one supplier effectively providing one chipset, and that's kind of it. So, the cost savings there are quite significant. I also like the idea that if the concept catches on, if it does capture some market share, you might actually see more agility in that space. Why wait for, 6 or 8 years for a new high-end SoC from Xbox to come along? Another one could come along in 3 years, for example. which would be entirely in keeping with the PC market. And then you've kind of like got a series of tiers of SoCs that slowly build up over time. And obviously there's going to be some kind of handheld equivalent, which we're kind of seeing an early view of it with the Asus ROG Ally X, but it is basically Strix Point. But there will be evolutions of that. So you've kind of like seeing things sort of evolving, in the stack evolving over time in two directions. I kind of like that idea, but it's a very PC-like strategy, and it's a very unconsole-like strategy as we know it. But then again, you look at the PlayStation 5 Professional costing $700, and you can see where the direction of travel is going in terms of console hardware.
Oh yeah,
it's getting more expensive. The other thing, of course, is the question as to there have been questions as to whether people will be priced out of gaming as a result. But all I can really say about that is, for all of the criticisms RTX 40 series received for its pricing, it sold a huge amount of GPUs. I think it may have actually sold more than 10 series from back in the day, which, if so, is like phenomenal. It kind of proves that people are okay with spending more money on gaming. But, it's not going to be, going back to Microsoft, it's not going to be a console as we know it, I don't think. Possibly in terms of sort of operation, it will be, but in terms of price points and stuff like that, there's a reason you're going to be able to run your Steam games on it. It basically means that the concept of a subsidized console is gone. That's surely going to happen. Any final thoughts, Oliver?
I think, the question of subsidy is kind of interesting here, because exactly what level of subsidy can you justify if there's no promise of platform lock-in, right? Yep. There's no promise of necessarily huge profits if the new console is successful, the new console-like device is successful. Because when you look at Sony right now, they're killing it in the console business. They're the most profitable they've ever been in consoles. Likewise with Nintendo, right? And a lot of that is built off the back of having a really successful platform. Here, Microsoft is going to be able to shift more Game Pass boxes. But in theory, a lot of different boxes now are Game Pass boxes or Xboxes or whatever you want to call them, right? So exactly, how much kind of market fit do they end up with translating sales of these boxes into Game Pass subscribers when they could just go on Steam and play their big libraries, right? That's certainly an open question. And it does call into question, how much subsidy are they going to be able to put into these boxes? Is there going to be a next-gen Xbox competitor that compares favorably to a PlayStation 6, right? That's kind of an open question at the moment.
I think the strategy is to get there earlier than PlayStation, produce an extremely powerful box, and you will pay a price premium for it, but I suspect it probably will do well simply because you are potentially expanding your total addressable market by including in anybody who's got games on Steam. I think that's kind of like the strategy there. Mm-hmm. It's certainly an interesting one, and it certainly ties into their multi-platform aspirations. But yeah, it's certainly interesting. Any final thoughts from you, John?
Oh man, I mean, you're right. Sony and Nintendo, they're making serious profits, but what if those profits were turned into supporting AI?
Yeah,
that's good. What if you could convincing me, John?
What if everything you sold on the console could be turned around and invested into Copilot? How awesome would that be? Man, the investors would hold a pizza party over that, I think.
Wow. Oh dear. With that, on that bombshell, let's move on. Right, so an interesting announcement this week from AMD. I'm not quite sure what this is all about, but basically there was a reaffirmation of the Project Amethyst collaboration between AMD and Sony. A nice PR photo of AMD and Sony coming together, brought together by a hewn block of amethyst. Which is kind of like symbolic of their collaboration together. This was followed up by a interview with, I think it was Tom's Guide, where Mark Cerny was basically bringing us updates on what Project Amethyst is doing for Sony, what it's doing for AMD, and for the market at large. There seem to be bigger goals there, which I find quite interesting. Now, Oliver, this interview seemed to cover a lot of ground that we already discussed with Mark Cerny in an interview a couple of months back, right? But is there anything, well, first of all, what has been reaffirmed and what's new?
I think the key element that's been reaffirmed here is that some kind of version of the algorithm behind FSR4 is going to be coming next year for a next generation PSSR update for PS5 Pro consoles. That is the information that was primarily described before to us. And, presumably that work will extend it to PS6, and that will help consolidate PS5 Pro's position as generally the most performant place to play console software. And hopefully that will deliver some of FSR4's image quality benefits for people who are playing PS5 Pro titles, especially in 60 FPS software, right, where the performance of the upscaler is really quite critical in a lot of these titles nowadays. The other interesting thing in this article, in this interview, is the detail that RDNA 5, as Mark Cerny calls it, apparently he's not, keen on whatever AMD's naming scheme happens to be for the next generation architecture, that it's going to probably have large parts of PS6 engineering on it, because Cerny phrases it here that will have some of the engineering work they've been putting into their next generation console contained within it. So I think probably they are more comfortable, I think, now making hints about the next generation PlayStation console as they approach closer to the 2027 or 2028 timeframe, or whenever they plan to launch it. And I think that Mark is kind of hinting at that here. But again, that's no real surprise that the PlayStation 6 would have elements of a next generation AMD graphics architecture in it. I'm pretty sure that's about as reliable a prediction as you could make, some years out from the PlayStation 6 debut. So just a couple details in there, but mostly an interview that covers a lot of ground that I think we already know, or at least supposed would be true.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's some sort of reaffirmation of what they were doing with AMD in light of an announcement from Microsoft 2 weeks earlier, which seemed to be very much hardware-based. Right. A collaboration on the hardware side, but Sony is saying, well, hold on a minute, actually, we've got a lot to give here. And there is actually the statement here that none of this is proprietary. Whatever AMD develops with Sony is actually likely to end up with whoever who wants to use it, which also makes a lot of sense. And I think the other thing which caught my eye is this quote: AMD is moving extremely quickly. What I'm trying to do here is prepare for the next generation of consoles. So my time frame is multi-year here, which kind of says to me we should be expecting RDNA 5 or whatever it's called to be arriving likely next year. Mm-hmm. And then PlayStation years on from that. So I guess it's kind of like almost preparatory work for what's going to be happening in PlayStation 6. And I actually kind of like the approach that that Cerny and indeed Sony are doing here. PlayStation 5 Pro, early work on machine learning, but machine learning is going to dominate the next generation proper, like hard. So the concept of getting a machine out there that developers can work with, having actual hardware out there that developers can work with, while at the same time collaborating with AMD on what's happening in the PC space, it does suggest that there is actually a strategy here, that there is a timeline that leads to PlayStation 6, which I find really exciting. I don't know what you make about all of that, John.
Yeah, there's not anything necessarily new in here, but it is interesting. I enjoyed hearing more about what they're doing with PSSR evolution, FSR4 kind of stuff, and how it's essentially like a drop-in replacement, making it easy to support. And yeah, it's all just kind of obvious stuff of where we're going next with AMD. And yeah, it's good to see, though. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also like the fact that it is explicitly described, the new upscaler is explicitly described as a drop-in replacement.
Exactly, because, that's key, right?
Absolutely. The concept that all of the games where, to be fair, we've seen good PSSR implementations, we've seen poor PSSR implementations. Mm-hmm. The idea that a developer can just go back and drop in the new FSR4-based solution is actually really, really good news. It could be game changing to certain games that we've looked at, so that's hugely exciting as well. But yeah,
it's the same thing with like DLSS, the CNN model versus the transformer model, right? Where it is basically drop in that same way, and that you can just leverage the power of the new model in games that weren't designed with it, and it's transformative, I would say. So that does excite me about the potential on the console, and that it could just greatly improve the experience for existing PSSR titles.
So interesting that we got this kind of PR piece, but not a huge amount of new information, but there are some tantalizing hints going forward. And I think in the past, also in our interview, there was discussion that there would be more of a unification between the hardware used for ML specifically. So, yeah, interesting stuff happening there. Okay, with that, let's move on. So this week there are a number of previews that quote unquote dropped for Donkey Kong Bonanza, and with it comes some interesting information that the development team is apparently the same development team that produced Super Mario Odyssey. And John, curious what you think about this. I mean, you're on point to review the game for us when the time is right, but interesting, right?
Yeah, so we didn't play any of the preview builds, but I went through a lot of the footage that's out there, and to me this always kind of made sense fundamentally, because we hadn't seen anything from that team for a while, and there's enough visual flourishes in this, including also the appearance of Pauline, that kind of suggests that yes, this is closely related to people that worked on Super Mario Odyssey, but based on what we're seeing, yeah, I mean, it does seem to essentially be their next big game. And considering that it's been quite a few years since Odyssey, that was a first-year Switch title. And I'm sure staff from that game have worked on other titles in the meantime as well. But as far as like that team creating something new, it's pretty exciting to actually have that sort of confirmed finally, and get to see what they're doing here new on Switch. My only concern right now is still like, there's definitely still a little bit of instability in the performance in some of those preview clips, but it does overall look pretty smooth. So we'll hold out hope for the final game at this point. But yeah. I mean, Mario Odyssey was like the third in the explorative Mario games. I think Nintendo itself specifically placed it alongside Super Mario 64 and Sunshine as that sort of Mario game, which meant that it was more open-ended and less driven by linear set level designs. And in a sense, it does seem Donkey Kong Bonanza has a lot of similarities in that regard, but at least based on some of the footage in the previews, it does seem to have a little bit more, I don't know, focus perhaps, that I'll be curious to see. And what's really curious about this is like that whole smashing mechanic that they show. It really feels like this would have been a really difficult game to develop in that sense, right? Where they want you to, like, there doesn't seem to be a stamina bar for one, like in so many other games that control the craziness. They kind of let you destroy a lot, but then also there seems to be enough guardrails in place and like materials and things designed to stop the player from destroying stuff. So like building levels that allow like a huge level of freedom, but then also constraining players in just the right way and ensuring none of it breaks while doing so. That seems quite interesting and challenging. So this really seems like this must have been a pretty big undertaking for that team. And I'm happy to see them sort of step into this role as like Nintendo's premier 3D platform development studio.
Right. Oliver, do you see this through line of from Super Mario Odyssey to Donkey Kong Bonanza?
I think there certainly is a conceptual through line, as John stated so eloquently there. But I think for me, it was just more of a visual through line where I thought, this looks a lot like Super Mario Odyssey, just visually, in terms of the way the characters look, in terms of the environments look. Obviously, it's built out in a way that Super Mario Odyssey was not. It has totally different gameplay mechanics. Obviously, there's this whole destruction system, and it's much denser, I would say. If you look at comparable stages in Super Mario Odyssey with some of the preview footage, like the kind of beach level in Super Mario Odyssey relative to some of the footage they were showing off here, definitely looks a lot better here, but definitely seems of that lineage. I think this is apparently Production Group 8, which is EPD Tokyo.
Right.
And yeah, that is the studio was responsible for Super Mario Odyssey. But the only thing that threw me about this up until this point did make me kind of wonder, like, is this maybe a third-party studio? Probably not, but is it? Is the fact that Nintendo refused to comment on the developer at all, like very pointedly refused to comment on it. And that's something they often do when a third-party developer is involved, like Grezzo. Now, I still thought this was probably a first-party joint just because of the way that it looked, because of, the apparent pedigree of the title. But was a little bit weird, and they're still refusing to confirm key staff, which again, it's kind of weird. Like, why wouldn't you want to make this a little bit more of kind of your front and center pitch? Like, this is coming from the Super Mario team, because that's a highly acclaimed game. I think people would be more excited about it if they had made that more clear. So that's a little bit confusing to me at the moment.
I agree.
John, can you make any kind of explanation for that?
I've been wondering about this for a while. They've been very sensitive about development studios. And yeah, you're right. It's mostly been third-party developed games or, partner studios. But you're right. This is it didn't used to be so much this way, but it feels like in the last few years, they've definitely taken on this sort of like air of secrecy where they don't really want to tell anybody who's developing it. Like I'm halfway expecting that the credits are just going to list like random like nicknames instead of actual people, just like the old 8-bit days or something. Because back in when games first were like becoming an industry, developers studios didn't want development names to be known because for fear of poaching and whatnot, right? Sharing secrets, and they would actually kind of actively hide that stuff. So like it feels like we're seeing shades of that again somehow, which is really, really weird. I really don't understand. I mean, we don't know enough about what business reasons they have for behaving this way. I mean, it could even be something as innocuous as they just wanted it to be a surprise for people, but it's probably not.
Yeah. And Nintendo, sometimes with their developers, they do have very public-facing development staff. Obviously, Shigeru Miyamoto, but also with Legend of Zelda, Eiji Aonuma. He's very, very public when he's talking about his new Zelda titles. So there is a bit of a split, decision within Nintendo whether to showcase their development partners or whether to not really show off their studios there.
Okay. Well, Donkey Kong Bonanza, it's coming out July 17th, I believe.
That's soon.
And yeah, I know you're looking forward to reviewing it, John.
Yep.
So I guess, well, we weren't involved in the previews, so I guess the first sort of Digital Foundry stuff you'll see will likely be the review. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what you come up with, John. Anyway, let's move on. Interesting news this week that Nvidia is actually sunsetting support for selected GTX 700, 900, and 10 series GPUs. Well, I say selective, it's basically the 700 is going to be the Maxwell cards, which is basically the GTX 750 and 750 Ti. 900, that would be all of the similarly based Maxwell GPUs in that lineup. Perhaps the surprise here is the 10 series GPUs are also sunsetting in terms of driver support. And that's actually raised a question from one of our supporters, Julian Schnitter, sorry, depending on which one it is, asks this: do you think it's too early for Nvidia to be dropping support for the 10 series? Given a 1060 is still number 12 on the Steam hardware survey, is this just Nvidia being greedy? I think at some point, John, support for a particular line of GPUs has to stop. It doesn't necessarily mean that those GPUs are not going to work anymore. It's just that you're not going to be getting game-ready drivers for them with specific optimizations.
Precisely. No, I think absolutely. And there's always a cutoff with software support. It's the same with any sort of hardware drivers for PC hardware, for game console firmware updates, even cell phones. Apple always, they have their cutoff limit where iPhones, iPads, etc. below this level no longer supported. Mm-hmm. And this isn't driven by like pure greed necessarily. It's more just like hardware ages, and there's like a certain minimum level of feature set that developers will be targeting, especially as different engines and such evolve. And it's pretty obvious that Pascal and prior don't support the features necessary, things like the ray tracing cores and everything that was introduced with the 20 series. It makes perfect sense to cut off at that point, despite still many of them being in use, because like you say, Rich, they're not just going to stop working. You can still use them if you want, but I would imagine most games being made today, developers would rather not have to deal with supporting cards that are outdated in terms of feature set. They don't match the features essentially required. They don't match the consoles anymore, right? And I always feel like that sets the baseline for a lot of games where like you kind of want your graphics cards to at least be able to support all the features that the modern day consoles can support. Just to make it so that, you're doing this multi-platform releases, and Pascal and Maxwell and the like, they don't support that. So
Yep.
it's time to let it go. Pour one out, though. I own one of all these cards, and, it's just like seeing names like GTX 780 pop up again. I'm like, oh, man. I remember when I got one of those.
I think 9 years is a pretty good run for the 10 series.
It's a great run. The 10 series was amazing. It was one of NVIDIA's best, I would say. It was a huge amount of value for the money. And I feel like anybody that purchased one and still using it can probably say that they got a very long life out of it, and it has served them well. And they can still use it if they want. It's just like it's time to move on. Like modern games just aren't going to support the features needed there.
Going back to Julian's point there, I mean, the 1060 had 6 gigs of RAM, so it's kind of automatically being deprecated just to the requirement of games that barely function without 8 gigs minimum. Other cards that are not supported going forward, the Volta architecture, which only ever saw the Titan V
or 5, I don't know, whatever it was. I guess Titan V because it's Volta, right? But yes,
I suspect it's Titan V. Yes. So basically, it's the end of driver support for GeForce GTX, except for the 16 series, which had a kind of cutback version of the Turing architecture.
Gosh, so Rich, I just have to comment. Thinking about Turing again, for a long time, viewers at Digital Foundry, Alex is like the ray tracing. He loves his ray tracing, right? We were there when he went to his very first game related event. We went to the reveal of Turing, and I'm sure you remember glancing over at Alex's face when Jensen was up there talking about ray tracing, like the amount of wonder, the stars around his head. It was incredible. He was so, like, you could see he felt like he was in a dream world. And it warms your heart to see a man made so happy by another man in a leather jacket holding a piece of silicon.
Yeah, he was literally slack-jawed.
Like he was just sitting there, like in awe, like leaned forward in his chair. Like it was incredible, man. He was so happy.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, is that there were Editors' Day events taking place afterwards, and Alex was in his element talking to the likes of 4A Games.
Oh man, it was incredible. I loved it.
Yeah, and DICE to talk about what they're doing with ray tracing. Yeah, that was pretty fantastic. Any thoughts on this whole situation there, Oliver? The time is right, isn't it?
I mean, they're really old GPUs. They were introduced before the current gen consoles by a healthy margin, and kind of like John said, those do kind of set the standard for where games are at the moment. And indeed, a lot of games require features that current generation consoles and newer hardware only really have, like hardware ray tracing. I don't think people are expecting to play a ton of new releases on these cards, even on something like a 1080, just because, newer games do require, obviously, the newer features, and also, I think most of these titles are being used for older games and lightweight games that you don't necessarily need the latest and greatest drivers to run efficiently there, and might not even be the target necessarily of a lot of these game-ready driver updates. But I would point out as well, I know, John, you brought up the practice that Apple has and many other phone manufacturers have, obviously, I mean, basically all other phone manufacturers have, of discontinuing updates past a certain point. With iPhones, with iOS 26, their September iOS update, they are cutting off phones released earlier than 2019. So in this case, NVIDIA has a more generous policy with respect to these architectures, especially like the 700 series cards that are over a decade old at this point, maintaining compatibility with those titles, with those cards for new titles for a very long period of time relative to other people who are operating in kind of the hardware space.
I think one final point to address is that despite the fact that 10 series was getting driver support, the level of optimizations that games received, I don't think it's the same as what happened with the RTX. I mean, when the RTX 2080 came along, it was pretty much equivalent to a 1080 Ti at launch. But now a 2080 does significantly outperform the 1080 Ti, even in games that aren't really sort of RT focused, where you'd expect, the 1080 Ti not to work at all. There has been this sort of gradual increase in performance from the 20 series across the years, whereas things haven't really progressed that much on the 10 series. So it's kind of just, reduced support and then coming up to no support, I think that's the bottom line. Anyway, with that, let's move on. Further leaks have emerged this week for the updated versions of the Nvidia Blackwell cards. I think we discussed this in the past, but it's now been all but confirmed by various leaks, including the king of all leakers, Copite 7 Kimi, effectively talking about precise specifications for 5070 Super and 5080 Super. It looks as though the 5080 Super is getting a VRAM bump. It's getting those 24 gigabit modules, which basically means a 16 gigabyte GPU becomes a 24 gigabyte GPU. And it means that a 12 gigabyte GPU becomes an 18 gigabyte GPU. So basically the same memory bus size, but more memory being addressed. It looks like the 5070 Super is getting a small CUDA-core boost, 6,400 cores versus 6,144 from the non-Super 5070. So you should expect to see a performance boost there, also higher power draw. And what can we say about the 5080 Super? It has that big memory upgrade.
Huge.
Also a big power draw boost, 415 watts versus 360, kind of crazy. Same CUDA core count though, 10,752. So there will be performance upgrades, but I suspect they will be quite slight, and it's all about the memory on the 5080, 5070, who knows what's going on there. Oliver, this doesn't look, I mean, bearing in mind there weren't huge performance boosts from 50 series anyway, over 40 series, doesn't look as though we're going to be seeing much in the way of further performance boosts, from, although the power draw increases are certainly intriguing. Curious what you think about this.
Yeah, these don't look like hugely enhanced cards from a strict kind of performance perspective necessarily in all titles. They just look like very similar cards, but with 3 gigabyte memory modules or 24 gigabit memory modules, to put another way, instead of 2 gigabyte modules there. So you basically get 50% more RAM, 8 gigabytes or 24 gigabytes, depending on the card here. And then, like you said, there's a small TDP increase or a moderate TDP increase. But I'm not that interested in these cards necessarily. I'm more interested in kind of two aspects of the market, both below these cards and above these cards. Because at the low end, specifically with like a potential 5060 Ti Super and 5060 Super, with 3 gigabyte modules, you could have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which is kind of like the lower bound, I would say, for most titles these days, operating at like 1440p resolutions, in some cases 1080p resolutions, to have a really reliable experience with current generation software without just destroying texture quality. That's certainly where you want to be at. So that's a very interesting part of the market, and I hope to see some movement there in terms of a super line that does expand VRAM. I'm also very curious to see if Nvidia does anything at the high end, because I remember specifically when Jensen introduced the RTX 5090, he introduced Blackwell as an architecture that maxed out at 4,000 AI tops in GB202 in its maximum implementation, but the 5090 only has 3,400 tops. And I recall at the NVIDIA Editors Day that Alex and I attended, it was clarified that discrepancy was down to implementation, because as you might expect, the 5090 is not a maxed out version of the full chip. Indeed, the full chip has about 10% more shaders, TMUs, and ROPs. And then you assume there, okay, 10% more in those areas, then maybe a higher clock rate, and you end up with a chip that is substantially more powerful than a 5090 could be. So, is that really needed? I think that's another question, but could they do it? Maybe they could in some limited quantities, expose a fully enabled or close to fully enabled 5090 chip that does indeed reach the promised specs that Jensen had laid out. That would certainly be very interesting to see that, but it would also be kind of interesting from a power consumption perspective, because obviously we've already maxed out the 12-pin connector. Would they go to two 12-pin connectors? Obviously you're dealing with very, very high power consumption in that case. So that would be very interesting to see if they do pursue a card like that for that kind of ultra high-end experience. But really, I think the more interesting area for this discussion is really at the kind of low end, which has not been addressed by these leaks, because I think 8 gigabytes for a GPU in 2025 is kind of tough to square with the VRAM demands of modern titles.
Yeah. This higher end chip that you're talking about, I mean, there's this kind of big gulf between the 5080 and the 5090 where there's, plenty of room for another product to slip in. But it doesn't look as though we're getting that, bearing in mind that these leaks seem to be starting at the top of the tree and going down. So that's kind of curious, because some sort of cheaper card that offers 4090 level of performance with multi-frame gen, I think, would be really good. But it doesn't seem like we're getting that. It looks like there is going to be a 5070 Ti Super as well, with the same 8,960 CUDA cores, but again, a memory bump from 16 to 24 gigabytes of memory, 50 watt power increase. I mean, we've shown in our reviews that this architecture could easily do 3 gigahertz, so there is potential for a performance boost there, but only by sort of 7-8% there. So it's not huge. It doesn't particularly excite me, this, bearing in mind that there wasn't a huge amount of excitement with Blackwell anyway. But I guess at least having more memory is a good thing. It's just that this is likely to be arriving like 1 year after the prior cards, which, there could be some buyer's remorse there, particularly for the 5070 owners. And yes, we don't know anything about what's going to happen with the 60 class products, which desperately need more memory. But John, what do you think about all of this?
I mean, anything related to increasing the amount of VRAM is positive news in my book. I'll be curious to see. It's just when you start to get into these weeds where you've got like a 5070 Super, but also 5070 Ti Super, it just feels like they're just like filling the stack with so many products right in that tier that you start to wonder, like, what's the price differential going to be, right? Because like a 5070 Ti Super shouldn't be quite as fast as a 5080, but it will offer significantly more VRAM, which can be very useful for a lot of people, depending on what you're doing, right? So like it starts to like weigh these questions, like, okay, what is all this going to cost? And like, is there just too many of these options now? Like, I don't know. It starts to get a little bit confusing. Like they're putting all this thought into this very center of the stack, and like I feel like the lower end of the stack could use more addressing, especially in regards to VRAM at this point. So
yeah, I guess it will come. It's just that
hopefully this is what we get, right?
Yeah, those lower end products are literally brand new at the moment.
But also, you're right though. There's this gap that you pointed, like when we first were looking at 50 series, like the gap between 5080 and 5090 is quite massive, right? And it feels it feels like there's, because they're filling the product line with so many different potential products, that feels like a natural place for like a step between 5080, 5090. And I don't necessarily think a 5080 Super will get there, looks like. So I don't know.
Yeah, there's also the question of what's happening with all those GB202 dies, because there's going to be quite a few that have got a number of deactivated CUDA cores, but just don't seem to be being used for some reason.
Lastly, though, I love the idea of appending things like TI and Super, because like when you start to apply it to the low end, it just seems funny. Like you think of like an RTX 5050 Ti Super, and that just seems ridiculous, right? It's like taking like the lowest. It's like taking a Honda Fit, but it's like the Honda Fit Ultra Sport Racing Edition or something,
Well, they do stuff like that.
I know they do. I know, but it's just I don't know, man. It's a weird one.
Okay, more memory is a good thing. I think it's Oliver. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a move up from say 16 to 24 gigs of memory is pretty good also for AI applications.
Yes, that dreaded term. Yes, very good for AI applications. Obviously, like a 5090 is the best for those kinds of applications. I'm on consumer graphics cards with 32 gigabytes. And then for very large models, you really want to be talking about something like the Strix Halo product from AMD, but moreover, really the Apple SoCs there, which can go up to 512 gigabytes of RAM with the M3 Ultra at the moment. Those are really kind of the best consumer devices for like AI workflows, AI development, if you need those super high memory capacities.
There's the more standard consumer as well, though, where extra VRAM and grunt really pays off, because Microsoft, when you put all those Copilot buttons around, I think they're up to like half a dozen now, more than that actually. Each one of those buttons, to drive it effectively, you need a little bit more GPU power and memory. Like those Copilot icons don't come free, and they are everywhere.
Wow. Okay. And with that, let's very quickly move on. Last news topic of the week, and this one kind of came out of the blue, and it's kind of fascinating. It looks as though, indeed, it has been confirmed that Helldivers 2 is coming to Xbox Series X and Series S. Even more curious is that Nix's software is going to be handling the port. John, kind of curious, certainly difficult timing, but welcome news nonetheless.
I think that's cool, and it makes a lot of sense for a multiplayer game like this, right? Just expand the audience and tap into existing Xbox user base. Like we were just talking about negative things for Xbox users, but this seems like a positive thing. I will say though, clicking through the social media and looking at the responses to this though, my goodness, dude, like the negativity is insane to me. Like people are so angry about this. Like, what are you doing for me, the Sony customer? Is the attitude that I'm seeing, and I'm just like, man, we're cooked. But for multiplayer games, what it does for you is it provides like a larger player pool, and it just increases the longevity of the game, I would say. And for games like this, that's a good thing. I mean, the numbers are still healthy for Helldivers 2, but adding more players, always a nice thing, I think. And I'll be curious to see what they do. And since it's Nixie's at the helm, it should be pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oliver, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the whole conversation about console exclusives can get extremely heated at times, and I did see some of that conversation on social media, and I think there is probably some amount of diffusing that needs to go on, because this is like Sony's most popular live service game. It launched day and date on PC. It's been PlayStation only on consoles for over a year now. And Sony has published games on Xbox before, like MLB The Show. They published Lego Horizon Adventures last year on Switch. They're no strangers to publishing on notionally competing platforms, even if that isn't their common practice. So I don't really think this reflects any like great change to Sony's plans, or indeed, like John suggested, the betrayal of some great swath of the PlayStation user base. I don't really think that's true on any level. No. I don't think this is particularly threatens, either should be perceived as particularly threatening to PlayStation customers or to Sony's existing kind of console exclusive and timed exclusive business model. This is a different kind of thing. I think mostly this is a different kind of thing. But I would be very interested to see how this game scales, especially on like Series S. Obviously Series X isn't much of a concern probably, but Series S is more interesting. Like, this is a really demanding game, and it doesn't have temporal upscaling on any platform, including PC, including PlayStation 5. So would they consider like a 720p 30 configuration in Xbox Series S? This is a really demanding game. And then, of course, even at 30 FPS, it has some significant frame pacing issues, which I covered earlier this year. And last year as well, covering PlayStation 5 Pro and PlayStation 5 consoles in this game. It's got some significant frame pacing issues at 30 FPS. Perhaps that comes from the Autodesk Stingray game engine or whatever they've got going on there in terms of implementing an FPS cap. Maybe that's not working out so well. So, yeah, just a few thoughts. I think that scaling this game is tough just because of how heavy it is. But it'll be interesting to see if they can come up with maybe some novel solutions. Considering this is Nixie's, perhaps, that's not Arrowhead, maybe they'll come up with something interesting.
Mm-hmm. Just generally, the discourse about the concept of anything vaguely Sony-related appearing on anything vaguely Xbox-related has just been quite remarkable over the last couple of weeks, to the point where somebody using an Xbox launcher on a PC to launch a Sony game caused outrage and uproar. Which is just astonishing to me. I mean, you know, it's a PC. You know, it's a launcher, but made by Microsoft. The game's running on a Microsoft operating system, for God's sake, using Microsoft APIs. There's a lot more going on here than what's launching it. It's just quite astonishing.
I think people need to get kind of more comfortable in general. PlayStation enthusiasts perhaps need to get more comfortable with this idea, because there are going to be a lot of PlayStation games that all of a sudden are playable on something called an Xbox rather soon in the next few years. They need to be comfortable with it. And also, like, I don't know, I mean, the PlayStation PC strategy, for the most part, outside of these live service games like Concord like Helldivers 2, is mostly to deliver games on PC with a significant lag. Like it's a 1 year lag, it's a 2 year lag. In some cases, it's up to a 6 year lag for titles like Uncharted 4. In some cases, they don't really seem that interested in putting them at all, or at least have not seemed interested in that so far. Like the Demon Souls remake, right? That would be a terrific game on PC. It's not showed up on PC up to this point. So, yeah, I don't think that strategy is like an execution of that strategy, carrying that over towards Xbox consoles or Xbox kind of PC type devices. I don't think that should be perceived as like particularly threatening in any way. And even just in general, the concept of exclusives arriving on other platforms, it should not be perceived as too threatening. I think that's a little bit silly.
Okay, good stuff. But let's move on now to supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I post on Patreon asking our supporters to comment on topics and suggest their questions for inclusion in the show. The ones that aren't like entire pages of text and we feel equipped to answer go into the show. Going to kick off with a couple actually about multi-frame generation. This one, first of all, from John Miser. Or Misa. Hello, exclamation point. Do you guys think that MFG has an unfairly poor reputation after re-entering the PC sphere after 15 plus exclusive years on console? My impression of frame generation when properly deployed is very positive. In December, I bought a well-priced 4070 Ti Super pre-build, but I wish I had access to 3x and 4x MFG. With current path trace games, if I can reach 45 to 60 FPS with DLSS, then 2x MFG, or 2x FG rather, increases to 80 to 100, which makes a large difference in fluidity. I personally see value in tripling/quadrupling FPS, irrespective of the popular fake frames sentiment. Penny for your thoughts. And a follow-up question from T-Money58. John, when using multi-frame gen 3x or 4x to amplify in frames well north of 200 FPS, is motion blur still needed? What do you think, John? Do you think MFG or frame generation in general has an unfairly poor reputation? I mean, I use it.
I do think
it depends, though, doesn't it?
It does depend. There's a lot of different use cases here, but the first thing I'm still confused by after re-entering the PC sphere after 15 exclusive years on console. Oh, he's talking about himself. I thought he was saying,
yes.
Like, wait, frame gen on console? Like what? Because I'm so focused on that. That's funny. So yeah, I do feel like it has gained a negative reputation, and I think this comes down again to what people are looking for in their screen-based experience. For me, having more frames is always welcome, and using high refresh rate monitors, the difference is vast. Like, if you look closely, you're going to spot some artifacts with frame generation on certain types of things. But I find that far, far, far less distracting than, a lower overall frame rate, because it's not just about response. To me, it's about the fluidity of motion. And when you're at these really high frame rates, it just feels better, it looks better to the eye in a way that I find extremely engaging. And you're able to essentially, like, I'm playing through Doom: The Dark Ages again here on my PC, and I'm doing 5120 by 2160 output, DLSS quality with multi-frame gen, all settings maxed out, including path tracing, and I'm just cruising along at 165 frames per second on this thing. Yes, fake frames are in there, but it looks incredibly smooth, and you get the full effect of the visuals. Artifacts, I feel, are relatively minimal, and it still feels very responsive to me. Now, so those are the two caveats, though, right? If you're very sensitive to any sort of frame gen artifacts, or you're very sensitive to input latency. I'm not that sensitive. I am to a degree, but it depends on the game as well. This is gonna vary from person to person. It also depends on kind of how you use your screen. Like, after the whole switch to screen discussion, it really became clear to me that different people focus on screens in a different way. Like what they're looking at, the way they perceive things. A lot of this depends on how your brain perceives that screen as to whether you think it's worth it or not. So, but when configured right, I love it. I always use it when I can to get those extra frames, and I think it's just it's an awesome thing that really allows you to sort of punch above where you might be without it, right? As for motion blur over 200 frames per second, I would say largely no, but does depend a little on the game. Some games use it in interesting ways that I still find valuable. But for the most part, not really. And I don't want camera motion blur over 200 FPS for sure. Because when you're doing all that sort of like lateral movement, the reason I like these super high frame rates is clarity. Because, like, say, when I use obviously OLED panels, big surprise, as everyone knows, but they're still sample and hold displays. So without something like black frame insertion or using like the CRT beam simulator, you're still limited by persistence blur. But once you start to hit these high refresh rates, so I've been doing a lot with that 333 hertz mode on this monitor lately, and like it's to the point where I feel like it exceeds most black frame insertion strobing implementations that I've seen, and you just get like really, really, really crystal clear motion that feels ultra smooth, and it's incredible feeling. I love it. And that's so motion blur actually gets in the way of that at those frame rates. I just played through Sigil 2, the Doom mod from Romero, at 330 hertz on there, and it's something I can't get enough of. So yeah, but that was native frames, right? Frame generation, multi-frame generation achieves that same level of fluidity. The caveats being just some slight artifacts, I would say, if you look very closely, usually around UI stuff.
Okay. Where do you sit on this, Oliver?
I mean, I think MFG is great, but I think MFG is really for ultra high refresh rates. And right now at the moment, I have a 144 hertz monitor and a 144 hertz television. And I personally kind of feel that's appropriate for 2x FG, not MFG.
Oh, yeah.
Occasionally. But on those displays, I really don't ever feel the need for MFG necessarily. I think it would be different if I had one of those great 4K 240 hertz monitors, or indeed something even higher refresh rate like a 360 hertz or 480 hertz monitor or something like that. But I kind of think in those cases, you can kind of MFG up to your refresh rate and just kind of let it sit there. But on my kind of display, I feel like I generally am operating without FG at all. When I am operating with FG in extreme like path racing scenarios, I'm only using 2FFG. So 2X FG rather. So yeah, I think MFG does make a large impact. Certainly I saw that at CES with Alex. Some of those titles with MFG on a nice 240 hertz OLED look incredible. But I don't think that applies necessarily to every single kind of display out there at every single refresh rate. I think you do want to be a bit judicious.
I can say that it's interesting you mentioned the slightly lower but still reasonably high refresh rate, as I did find going from 120 hertz max up to 165 max in the 5K mode on this newer monitor did allow multi-frame gen to become usable, whereas on the at 120 hertz target, it was basically unusable to me. Like the artifacts were too severe and the latency increased because the base frame rate lowered enough where 3x frame gen to 165 is actually very, very usable and minimal artifacts. But one thing I didn't mention is the sort of the non-smart frame generation, like what loss of scaling is doing. This is also something I've been playing around with a lot lately, specifically with 2D pixel art games and other 3D games that don't. It's like the smooth motion thing from Nvidia, but I feel like loss of scaling does an even better job these days with its current 3.1 iteration. For something like, for instance, playing through Sonic Mania again, I stumbled over the ultra wide mod for that game, so I could fill the whole screen and get the increased field of view. But it's a game capped at 60 frames per second, right? Adding in loss of scaling frame generation does increase that fluidity to 120 frames per second, or 240 if you're, doing basically multiples of 60. You get the full benefits, and it genuinely looks like it's running at a higher frame rate, not just like a frame interpolated one. Now, certain types of pixel patterns can cause some artifacts, but I felt like it's largely worth it and mostly artifact free for that massive boost in clarity and fluidity that you get with the higher frame rate. So it is worth experimenting with that too in certain scenarios.
So from my perspective, first of all, to sort of come back on a couple of points you made about sort of 3x MFG. First of all, I think you're quite right. You've got to adjust the MFG level to suit the refresh rate of the panel, which in turn will require different factors depending on challenging the game is to render in the first place. Secondly, if you have a less capable GPU, then you may need to use higher factors, but at the expense of latency, and obviously your base frame rate will be lower. The lower end GPUs, you require a really good sort of tuning experience to actually get a good experience, I think, with MFG, because your base latency has got to be pretty decent.
Right.
But, 5060 Ti, you can play Cyberpunk in, up to like, I think I've done like 200 frames per second, and it's all about optimized settings to get there. And obviously, perhaps you wouldn't need 4x MFG. Perhaps you need 3x to go to like 144 or 165. To answer the question more specifically about an unfairly poor reputation, it's a tool. It's an option. I think when it stops being an option and when it becomes a requirement, then maybe there is a lot more pushback that's warranted, depending on the quality of the implementation. The thing, for example, Mind's Eye, booted with frame generation actually active already as a default. Monster Hunter Wilds, it kind of pops up saying, you really want to turn on multi-frame generation. You really want to turn on frame generation. It's like, do I? And then you sort of say no, and it says, really? And you don't really want that. It's an option. It shouldn't be a mandatory tool. However, the technology is going to progress. It is going to get better. We will reach a point where it is essentially going to max out the refresh rate of your monitor. It will just do it by default. Latency will probably improve. And at that point, maybe it is worth, maybe the sort of mandatory side of things, or rather sort of recommended. It probably has more merit. I think the reason it has an unfairly poor reputation is, and it does go back to those bar charts, I'm afraid. Having frame gen and multi-frame gen in bar charts and kind of suggesting that it's the same quality of experience as non-frame gen is an issue, but I think it's also an issue with the concept of bar charts in general. I mean, there's a lot going on that that is missing, nuance that's missing when you're just looking at bar charts. I think that's one of the reasons why it's got a poor reputation versus the actual experience, which, a lot of people are very, very happy with. And the feature does seem to have a lot of pickup. And the other thing which I think you should bear in mind is the fact that if frame generation was such a bad idea, why is it that everybody is pursuing their own frame generation technologies? AMD followed Nvidia, Intel followed Nvidia, Apple are now producing their own frame generation technology. Mm-hmm. You can, of course, FSR Redstone, AI-generated frames, is going into a part of that, which in turn means it's going to be in PlayStation, which in turn means it's going to be in Xbox consoles. It's just part of the direction of travel moving forward, just as upscaling is now. Obviously, you can have good upscaling and bad upscaling experiences, just as you can have good and bad frame generation experiences. I think the issue is with frame generation is that you've got to have good performance to begin with in order to have a good experience. If frame generation is not going to turn a bad experience into a good one. I think that's the other differentiating factor. And that's something else that the bar charts don't really show. You can have low base frame rates in your bar chart and suddenly that bar extends dramatically, but it's not going to be great. And that's what I think about that. It's a tricky one for sure. Anyway, let's move on. Interesting question here from Snorlax Jobless. Which wasn't a sentence I was predicting that I'd say today, but here we go. Do you think that the Switch 2 dock's authentication chip could also be a hurdle for VRR output? So here's the thing, right? Switch 2 dock. There's been a lot of discussion this week about the fact that you can plug the Steam Deck into it and VRR works. There's also been the fact that Nintendo has been trying to lock out third-party docks by having some sort of proprietary protocol, a handshake of sorts between the dock and the console, which makes third-party docks difficult to put out. But there is one, which I'm trying to get hold of at the moment. Oliver, what do you think about this? I mean, the whole concept that VRR isn't available with the docked output from the Switch 2 is a bit baffling. But do you think that this protocol, this proprietary protocol, could be a part of the issue here? I'm not sure.
I don't think so, just because the security chip is basically checking, like, is this a Switch 2? It's basically sending some vendor-defined messages so that the system will only enter kind of the Switch 2 configuration mode with docks that can actually answer this proprietary challenge of like 30 odd messages that Nintendo is sending back and forth. But that occurs before any kind of video stream exists, any kind of display mode is operating there. But once it basically replies correctly, if it does reply correctly, it enters into that kind of display mode with the Switch 2. So yeah, I don't suspect there is a problem here, because it's a separate process to like the display output process, and that display output process is when you would expect that VRR information to obviously be of some concern there. So I don't think it would be an issue for this purpose.
Okay. John, what do you think about all of this? The concept of Switch 2 not supporting VRR while marketing it heavily for the handheld has been a bit of an eye-opener and a bit weird, hasn't it? But yeah, the concept, I think the dock has basically now been ruled out as the problem.
Yeah, I don't think the dock's the problem at all. I think it's still, as we kind of predicted or suggested before, is that it's the display port to HDMI conversion through USB-C that is making this difficult. And even with the Steam Deck, getting VRR to work on the deck, I mean, parts of this is down to Linux, I guess, and its weirdness with VRR, but it's not easy, I would say. The Steam Deck, you can't just plug it into like any dock and just have VRR to start working. It usually requires you to kind of play around with rebooting it. I can't even usually get it to work properly in the main Steam OS level. It's just, I find it frustrating, and I guess it's just any time I've experimented with DisplayPort to HDMI, I've had all sorts of issues with VRR, including, I don't know if you ever used one, but just doing like a DisplayPort to HDMI cable into a display. That is bad times. It is bad times. It does not work well. There's a lot of issues doing that. So, and specifically, like if having VRR enabled in Windows while messing around with such a cable causes Windows to go berserk. It just keeps like unlocking and unlocking from the monitor, and like Windows is blinking and changing and going insane until you unplug it. But if you get in there and manage to disable VRR and then plug it in, it'll actually work. So I suspect it's something along those lines that's causing the problem. Like, I think it may technically be feasible, but clearly it's not a plug and play kind of thing. And there may even be compatibility issues, even if they did get it going.
But yeah, I think, the whole VRR situation on Switch 2 has been a bit disappointing, bearing in mind it doesn't seem to work properly in so many games that should be supporting it and producing a good experience. And then there was the whole situation where Nintendo seemed to be suggesting in its marketing that it could work, VRR could work on via the dock, but then it turned out it couldn't. Yeah, it's been a bit of a mess, to be honest.
Big time.
Anyway, let's move on. Got a question here from Hunter. In the past, you've been proponents of 40 FPS modes in games like Ratchet and Clank, even if they're a bit more niche, as they only benefit those with 120 Hz displays. I'm surprised I haven't heard much talk of it now that every Switch 2 owner has a 120 Hz display. Seems to me like 40 FPS could be the Goldilocks zone for games like Fast Fusion between performance and image quality. I forgot to phrase this like a question. Fair enough. What do you think? More 40 FPS modes for Switch 2 games. I'm all for it, John, as long as VRR can work correctly, because the chances of a lock to 40 are very much game specific.
Yeah, so that's kind of the problem again. And if you actually look at the list of games that have released on the Switch, there's not even that many that would really benefit from this. Just a few. Ones like Cyberpunk, of course, which has a 40 frames per second mode. But there's a lot of 60 FPS on here. But there's a few it could benefit. But I think you're right. The confusing thing here still is the lack of VRR support, which CD Projekt Red even talked about that being central to their vision for Switch 2 at some point in an interview, like VRR capabilities, and then it didn't manifest in any way, which is certainly confusing, I must admit. Um, but yeah, I mean, something like, I guess, Hitman would have been that's probably one of the better ones, where I could see
Yeah.
like a proper 40 FPS mode being quite useful, just capping it. But as we know with Hitman, they never cap that. It always has run free. That's just the nature of it, right? Maybe just, what about No Man's Sky? Does that have a 40 FPS mode?
It does, but it's there's a new patch coming we haven't looked at yet, but it's got issues.
So, I mean, the fact that we've seen several titles at least embrace that at launch suggests that we'll probably see more of that going forward. How much?
Yep.
That's still up in the air, and we still need the VRR problem solved for ones that can't hold it steady, but I'm fairly positive that we'll see more of it going forward.
Oliver, what do you think about this?
I mean, I think we're in early days for Switch 2 software. For Fast Fusion in particular, I mean, I think it benefits greatly from 60 FPS just from a gameplay perspective, even with the image quality hit. I do think 40 FPS would be interesting, though, and I think it's even more interesting because Shinen has like 8 total modes, and all of them are either 30 FPS or 60 FPS. There's no 40 FPS mode between 8 effective modes across 2 configurations of the console, both docked and portable play. So I find that a little bit odd, but I expect we will see more 40 FPS as the console matures. Of course, factoring in that many televisions will not support 40 FPS gameplay, right? It'll be a feature mostly for the portable mode and then for 120 hertz output on the dock, which not all televisions will support.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'd like to see more 40 FPS support across the board, really. We have seen some hints of it, obviously, with some of the Switch 2 launch titles, but, you know, there is that issue that you just can't really rely on it because of the VRR issue. You know, a game's locking to 40 is quite a challenge for a handheld. So something has to change there. Anyway, let's move on. Skyrim Fest 26, in brackets, AI Upscaled, asks, if Nvidia launched a console tomorrow with a good price, with a fast ARM CPU and 5070 level performance, with all the Nvidia trimmings like DLSS, frame gen, and ray tracing, do you think it would succeed? I'm wondering whether it's realistic these days to have 2 cutting-edge home consoles competing in the market, even if it was the reasonable best of breed from a technical perspective. Well, let's sort of focus on the concept of an Nvidia console. My personal viewpoint on it is that, well, when Xbox and Windows merge and PCs are also having decent ARM support, there's no reason why this can't happen. And we're actually going to get a preview of this when the laptop chip, which I believe is a collaboration with MediaTek, arrives. Oliver, thoughts?
I think it would be interesting, but like you said, I think it would have to be something that gloms onto an existing kind of console-like interface for PC effort. Maybe it could be a SteamOS device, possibly it could be a Windows device, obviously when that platform matures in the next year or two, potentially there. But I think there are some questions about would Windows operate in a performant manner, or just x86 apps in general operate in a performant manner on an ARM chip and with good enough compatibility, especially in a home console environment where expectations might be higher relative to like a laptop, where you might be playing games occasionally. This is a home console. The expectations are very high for performance, I would have to say here. But I don't think it would be very wise, and I don't think that NVIDIA would pursue this option at all, but I don't think they'd pursue a discrete platform. I think that market is pretty much settled at this point, and I do think, you know, in infamous fashion, you kind of do need to have enduring success going back past several generations now to actually have a firm stake in the console market and to be able to stake out a console that could actually achieve some success there.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of building up a new platform from scratch isn't viable, which is why I'm talking about the Xbox on Windows situation, because I think that's probably the best platform for NVIDIA to succeed. But it does rely on having a good ARM translation layer that's going to be required, because obviously NVIDIA can't do x86. Anything to add to that, John?
I think I agree with you, Oliver. Technically speaking, they could do it, but I don't think that there's anything interesting enough to a company like Nvidia to venture out into the subsidized console market by themselves at this point. I think at most they're happy to be a partner for a company like Nintendo, but like clearly this is not where their fortunes lie. And I think it would be really, really, really difficult to break into this market now without some sort of brand cachet or something. I don't really. I mean, I think Microsoft is starting to fall out of it, obviously, as we've been discussing. Is there anyone else out there that you think could actually succeed in this space?
No.
I don't think there is.
I mean, there are definitely people with the money to do it. Like if Apple wanted to do this, they could do it, but I don't think there's like a really compelling reason to do it as an alternative to like Nintendo or Sony or even Microsoft. I don't think there's
I feel like it's too late. Like when all those consoles originally were released, like when they first made game consoles in the early days of the stuff, making new games was a smaller proposition. You could do it with a far less staff in much less time. It was easier to get a foothold pretty quickly and just like get stuff made, where I feel like the spin up time necessary to actually have a first party lineup that can compete would be so long and so expensive. And that's the main thing that would get people to want to come to your platform in the first place. It seems impossible to me.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder whether we will reach the point at some point in the future where games will launch with x86 and ARM executables. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, on PC. I mean, I absolutely see that happening because, I mean, obviously we're seeing a big push for ARM and Windows space in a way that I don't think has really, like, we've seen ARM on Windows before, but it never really had any sort of chance of success at the time. But I feel like with the new Surface stuff and other companies making like mobile computing that now favors ARM in an effort to sort of get battery life up and make these things more efficient, plus just the efficiencies made to ARM, I don't know, it's becoming viable as a gaming platform. We know it is. Yeah. So it would make sense to cater to some of those markets as well.
That's indeed what happens on Macs at the moment. You can either download an ARM Apple Silicon binary or an x86 binary for a lot of popular applications, right? For most applications that are out there. But in a lot of cases, you wouldn't really notice the difference because Rosetta 2 is so efficient at translating x86 code.
It is. Yeah.
It doesn't really matter at some point. So it's fine either way.
Yeah, obviously we do have that MediaTek collaboration coming, which I'm really looking forward to seeing. Give us some idea of what's going on there. And also, of course, we have Switch 2, which, NVIDIA SoC there, which is punching well above its weight, I'd say, bearing in mind the 8nm process there. Anyway, final question. Let's move on. This one comes from Simplex. Does John have the 1997 PS1 racing game Ray Tracers in his physical collection? Judging by the name, it should be a Digital Foundry favorite.
Yes,
do you have the
I
game?
do. It's right over there on the shelf. It's very cool. It's a Taito racing game, a little bit Chase HQ, but it has a very special technical feature that makes it worthy of the name Ray Tracers. There's no ray tracing in it, obviously.
Oh.
But what it does have is render to texture reflections, which is unbelievably rare on the PlayStation 1, where essentially they are rendering a viewport into a texture on the windshield and glass of the car that actually draws the surroundings around you on that texture. So you're getting like accurate looking reflections to the environment on your car, which is something we would see a lot during the PS2 era, right? Like all this, when GT3 hit and had like this kind of stuff going on, it was amazing. It's like, wow, you can actually see the bridges and the trees and everything reflected on the car. But Ray Tracers did that on PlayStation 1 in 1997, which is super, super cool.
I do like the idea of like just a question that was born out of whimsy actually producing a viable Digital Foundry response.
That's true. And it's,
I'm still of the belief that every fighting game, there should be an open source fighting game character called Ray Tracing. And he can go into any fighting game and then you can just say, yes, Ray Tracing is in this game.
Well, I was thinking you were talking about like a rebranded Dural from Virtua Fighter.
Well, that could be the open source nature of the character.
That's the perfect character for ray tracing. Like if they, I'm hoping that when they finally get around to hopefully revealing Dural for Virtua Fighter 6, that ray tracing is in full effect on her.
Thing is that, a Dural-like character probably wouldn't sort of be a good idea for a character called Ray Tracing.
That's true. That's true.
It's just some dude. It's called ray tracing.
Make it look like Alex.
Yeah, that would be awesome. You could maybe have like a sort of flashy reflective coat or something.
Oh yeah, I love it.
That would be, yeah, so there is the option.
It's like the Watch Dogs trench coat, but it's like reflective.
Okay, well, that was the final question, therefore, to the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. Please do consider the DF supporter program, though, if you like what we do. And yeah, early access to a bunch of stuff there, including the direct and other stuff too. News updates from the team, high quality video downloads of everything we do. But that's all from us for this week. See you next week. And in the meantime, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.